Sarah Chen Williams pulled her Tesla Model X into the exclusive parking area of Richardson Executive Airport on a bright Thursday morning. The spring sun reflected off the sleek private jets lined up on the tarmac, their metal surfaces gleaming like polished mirrors. At 38 years old, she had worked hard to build her aviation company from the ground up, turning it into one of the most successful private jet businesses in the country. Today had started like any other day. Sarah had chosen to wear her comfortable travel outfit, designer jeans, a soft gray cashmere sweater, and practical walking shoes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup after a long week of back-to-back meetings. She planned to fly home to surprise her daughter's piano recital that evening. The private terminal stood separate from the main airport building, its modern glass walls and steel frame creating an impressive sight against the clear blue sky. Sarah grabbed her small carry-on bag and laptop case from the trunk, her movements unhurried and confident. She had made this walk hundreds of times before, both as a passenger and as the owner of Chen Williams Aviation. As she approached the terminal entrance, Sarah noticed a new security guard standing at his post. His name tag read James Miller, and his uniform looked freshly pressed, suggesting he was relatively new to the job. Sarah offered him a friendly smile as she reached for her credentials, a gesture she had performed countless times before. The morning was quiet, with only the distant sound of jet engines and the occasional radio chatter from the control tower breaking the silence. A few ground crew members moved efficiently around the parked aircraft, performing their pre-flight checks and maintenance routines. Some of them recognized Sarah, waving respectfully from a distance. Inside her designer bag, Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from her executive team. They were updating her about their latest acquisition, a new Gulfstream G650 that would join their growing fleet next month. The company had come a long way from its humble beginnings 10 years ago, and Sarah had started with just one leased jet and a dream. As she reached the security checkpoint, Sarah noticed something different in the guard's demeanor. His posture stiffened, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he looked her up and down. She had seen that look before, a subtle shift in expression that suggested someone was making assumptions based solely on her appearance. The morning air felt heavier suddenly, and the familiar sounds of the airport seemed to fade into the background. Sarah maintained her professional composure, having dealt with similar situations throughout her career. She had learned early on that success didn't shield her from prejudice. Sometimes, it even seemed to magnify it. Other passengers began arriving at the terminal, mostly men in business suits who were greeted with quick nods and waves through the security checkpoint. A few of them knew Sarah from previous flights or business dealings, but they were too engrossed in their phones to notice the situation unfolding. Sarah's pilots were already doing their pre-flight checks on her company's flagship jet, a beautiful Bombardier Global 7500 with the Chen Williams Aviation logo prominently displayed on its tail. Captain Rodriguez, her chief pilot, could be seen in the cockpit, going through his usual thorough preparation routine. The terminal's large windows offered a perfect view of the runway, where another private jet was taking off, its engines roaring as it lifted into the morning sky. This was the world Sarah had worked so hard to be part of, the world she had helped shape and improve through her leadership and innovation. She reached into her bag for her identification and ownership credentials, maintaining a calm and professional demeanor despite the growing tension in the air. Years of experience had taught her that these moments, though uncomfortable, could become opportunities for change. The security guard's next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his perspective, but would also become a powerful lesson about prejudice and redemption in the aviation industry. What happened next would test Sarah's patience, leadership, and ability to turn a negative situation into a positive learning experience for everyone involved. Little did either of them know that this seemingly routine Thursday morning would become a turning point in both their lives, leading to unexpected consequences and growth that would ripple through the entire airport community. The morning's peaceful atmosphere shattered as security guard James Miller held up his hand, stopping Sarah firmly in her tracks. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to head over to the main terminal," he said, his voice carrying a hint of authority that seemed unnecessarily forceful. Sarah blinked in surprise, her hand still holding out her credentials. "There must be a misunderstanding," she said calmly. "I'm cleared for the private terminal. In fact, I'm the owner of Chen Williams Aviation." She gestured toward one of the jets bearing her company's logo. James crossed his arms, a skeptical look crossing his face. Listen, ma'am, I've worked security long enough to know who belongs where. The main terminal is that way. He pointed toward the larger building in the distance, speaking slowly as if explaining something to a child. The few other people in the private terminal began to take notice of the situation. A businessman lowered his newspaper, watching the scene unfold over his reading glasses. Two ground crew members stopped their work, exchanging concerned glances. If you'll just look at my identification, Sarah tried again, keeping her voice steady despite the growing frustration she felt. She pulled out her CEO badge, company ownership papers, and pilot's license. She had learned long ago to always carry multiple forms of identification. James barely glanced at the documents. Anyone can get fancy papers made these days, he said dismissively. I'm sure whatever airline you're looking for is at the main terminal. This area is for private jet owners and their approved guests only. Sarah took a deep breath, drawing from years of experience in handling difficult situations. The irony wasn't lost on her, being denied entry to a terminal where 3 of her own aircraft were parked less than 100 yards away. A young flight attendant named Maria, who had worked for Sarah's company for 2 years, watched the scene from near the coffee station. She started to move forward to help, but Sarah caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of her head. She had handled situations like this before, and she knew the importance of letting them play out properly. Mr. Miller, Sarah said, reading his name tag again, I understand you're doing your job. However, I am the CEO and owner of Chen Williams Aviation. Those are my jets on the tarmac, and I have a flight scheduled in 20 minutes. James shifted uncomfortably but stood his ground. Ma'am, if you don't head to the main terminal, I'll have to call for backup. We have strict protocols here. His hand moved to rest on his radio, a clear attempt to intimidate. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal's large windows, highlighting the tension in the air. Outside, Sarah's pilots were completing their pre-flight checks, unaware that their boss was being blocked from boarding her own aircraft. 2 more security guards had noticed the commotion and were slowly making their way over. Sarah could see their uncertain expressions. They were new too, following James's lead without questioning his judgment. Perhaps we could call the terminal manager, Sarah suggested, maintaining her professional tone. She checked her watch, aware that this delay was affecting her schedule. Her daughter's piano recital was just hours away. James's face reddened slightly. The terminal manager doesn't need to be bothered with this. Rules are rules, and you need to follow them like everyone else. His voice had grown louder, drawing even more attention. Sarah noticed a small crowd gathering now. Some were regular clients who flew with her company, their faces showing confusion and concern. Others were airport staff who had worked with her for years, watching the scene with growing disbelief. The security guard's radio crackled with routine airport communications, breaking the tense silence that had fallen over the terminal. Outside, another private jet taxied past, its engines humming softly in the background. This confrontation was about to reach its turning point, though neither Sarah nor James knew it yet. The next few moments would transform a simple misunderstanding into a powerful lesson about prejudice, judgment, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. The terminal's glass doors slid open behind them, and footsteps approached quickly. Someone else was about to enter this scene, someone who would change everything about this Thursday morning confrontation. Terminal manager Robert Thompson rushed through the sliding glass doors, his face showing immediate concern as he took in the scene before him. At 55 years old, with 20 years of airport experience, he had known Sarah since she first started her company. What's going on here? Robert asked, his eyes moving between Sarah and the security guard. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the tension on everyone's faces. Before Sarah could respond, James stepped forward, his chest puffed out with authority. Sir, I was just explaining to this woman that she needs to go to the main terminal. She's insisting she owns private jets. He let out a short laugh, making it clear how ridiculous he thought this claim was. Robert's eyes widened in disbelief. James, do you know who this is? Someone who doesn't understand airport security protocols, James replied firmly. I've been in security for 8 years, sir. I know when someone's trying to access areas they shouldn't. Sarah remained quiet, watching as the situation unfolded. More people had gathered around them now. Maria, the flight attendant, was whispering to other staff members. Several pilots from different companies stood nearby, their faces showing a mix of shock and disapproval at James's behavior. She keeps showing me these papers, James continued, gesturing dismissively at Sarah's credentials. But anyone could fake those. And honestly, sir, does she look like someone who would own private jets? A collective gasp went through the crowd. Even James seemed to realize he had said too much, but he stood his ground, too proud to back down now. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Miller, I'm curious what exactly someone who owns private jets is supposed to look like. The terminal fell silent. Even the usual airport sound seemed muted. James shifted uncomfortably, his face reddening as he realized the hole he was digging himself into. I just meant, he stammered, struggling to find words that wouldn't make the situation worse. Captain Rodriguez, Sarah's chief pilot, had now entered the terminal. He had been wondering why his boss hadn't arrived at the plane for their pre-flight check. His presence added to James's growing discomfort. Look, James said, trying to regain his authority, I'm just following protocol. We can't let just anyone walk into the private terminal claiming they own jets. Do you know how many security risks that could create? Robert Thompson had heard enough. James, this is Sarah Chen Williams. She's the CEO and owner of Chen Williams Aviation. Those 3 jets out there with the blue and silver logo, those are hers. This company, she built it from nothing. James's face went pale. He looked at the jets through the window, then back at Sarah, then at the growing crowd of employees and clients who all clearly knew exactly who she was. But she didn't. James struggled to find words, his earlier confidence crumbling. Didn't what, Mr. Miller? Sarah asked quietly. Look like what you expected. Dress the way you thought a CEO should dress? Or was it something else that made you so sure I didn't belong here? The security guard's radio crackled, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the terminal. Outside, one of Sarah's jets gleamed in the morning sun, its presence a silent rebuke to James's assumptions. Several other security guards who had gathered looked embarrassed, avoiding eye contact with everyone. They had followed James's lead without question, and now they too were part of this uncomfortable situation. I apologize, James finally managed to say, though his words sounded hollow and forced. I was just trying to do my job. Your job, Sarah replied, still maintaining her composure, is to ensure security, not to make assumptions about people based on their appearance. Those assumptions don't make this terminal safer. They just create barriers for people who have every right to be here. Robert Thompson stepped forward, clearly preparing to take disciplinary action, but Sarah held up her hand, stopping him. She had handled situations like this before, and she saw an opportunity for something more valuable than punishment. The next few moments would prove crucial, not just for James's career, but for everyone watching. What happened next would transform this uncomfortable confrontation into an unexpected lesson about prejudice, growth, and the power of responding to bias with wisdom rather than anger. The private terminal lobby had become unnaturally quiet. Sarah stood calmly in the center of attention, while James, the security guard, looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. The morning sun continued to stream through the large windows, highlighting the uncomfortable scene. Mr. Miller, Sarah said, breaking the tense silence, would you walk with me for a moment? She gestured toward the large windows overlooking the tarmac. James hesitated, looking at terminal manager Robert Thompson for guidance. Robert nodded, and James slowly followed Sarah to the window. His earlier confidence had completely disappeared, replaced by visible shame and embarrassment. The crowd watched them, curious about what would happen next. Do you see that Gulfstream G650 right there? Sarah pointed to the sleek jet closest to the terminal. That was the first jet I ever bought outright for my company. I remember the day it arrived. I stood right here in this spot, watching it land, hardly believing it was real. James shifted uncomfortably, staring at his shoes. Ms. Chen Williams, I am so sorry. I make terrible assumptions, and I was completely wrong. Look at me, please, Sarah said gently. James lifted his eyes, meeting her gaze for the first time since learning who she really was. I want to show you something else. She pulled out her phone and opened a photo gallery. The first picture showed a much younger Sarah, standing in front of a small, worn-down office building. This was my first aviation office, 10 years ago. I started with nothing but a dream and a business plan that every bank in town had rejected. James looked at the photo, then at the successful businesswoman standing before him. The contrast was striking. Sarah continued scrolling through pictures, showing the growth of her company over the years. "That's my first employee there," she pointed to another photo. "And that's the tiny desk where I worked 18-hour days, making calls, building connections, proving myself over and over again." Her voice remained calm, but carried the weight of her experiences. The terminal staff and onlookers remained silent, many of them hearing this story for the first time. Captain Rodriguez smiled proudly. He had been with the company for 8 of those 10 years and had seen much of this growth firsthand. "The aviation industry wasn't always welcoming to someone like me," Sarah continued. "I've been stopped at security checkpoints, questioned in my own office, and asked to prove myself countless times. But do you know what I learned, Mr. Miller?" James shook his head, still struggling to find words. "I learned that change doesn't come from anger or punishment. It comes from understanding. From moments exactly like this one." She turned to face him fully. "Tell me, what made you so sure I didn't belong here?" James swallowed hard, knowing his answer would reveal his prejudices. I guess I had a certain image in my mind of what a private jet owner looks like. And," he trailed off, the bias in his thinking becoming painfully clear to him. "And I didn't fit that image," Sarah finished for him. "Instead of checking my credentials properly, you let that assumption guide your actions. That's not good security work, is it?" "No, ma'am," James replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah glanced at her watch. Her daughter's piano recital was still hours away, but she had a more important task right now. She looked back at terminal manager Robert Thompson, who was waiting expectantly. "Robert," she called out, "instead of disciplinary action, I have a different suggestion." The manager stepped forward, curious. "I think Mr. Miller might benefit from joining our company's next diversity and security training session. In fact, I'd like him to help develop part of it, based on what happened here today." The surprise on James's face was evident. He had expected to be fired, not offered a chance to learn and improve. The other security guards exchanged glances, realizing they too had lessons to learn from this incident. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes can become our best opportunities for growth," Sarah said, addressing not just James but everyone in the terminal. "That is, if we're willing to learn from them." The tension in the terminal began to fade, replaced by a sense of respect and admiration for Sarah's handling of the situation. What had started as an ugly confrontation was transforming into something unexpectedly positive and educational. Later that morning, Sarah sat across from James Miller in the terminal's small conference room. The Venetian blinds were partially closed, creating thin lines of sunlight across the polished table. A coffee cup sat untouched in front of James, who hadn't stopped fidgeting since they sat down. Terminal manager Robert Thompson had given them the room for a private conversation. Outside, the regular activities of the airport continued. Jets taking off, others landing, the constant movement of ground crews going about their duties. "Ms. Chen Williams," James began, his voice shaky, "I don't even know where to start. I've never been more ashamed of myself in my entire life." Sarah took a sip from her own coffee cup before responding. "Start by telling me about yourself, James. How long have you been working in airport security?" James straightened in his chair slightly. 8 years total, ma'am, but only 2 weeks here at the private terminal. Before this, I worked at the main commercial terminal across town." "And what made you want to work in airport security?" Sarah's question was gentle, encouraging him to open up. James looked surprised by the question. He had expected more criticism, not genuine interest in his background. "My father was a police officer," he said slowly. "I always wanted to work in security to protect people. But today I realized I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just being." He trailed off. "Biased." Sarah finished for him. "Let me share something with you, James. 10 years ago, when I started this company, I walked into a bank wearing an expensive suit and carrying a solid business plan. The banker took one look at me and assumed I was there to open a basic checking account. He didn't even want to look at my business proposal." James winced, recognizing the similarity to his own actions earlier. "But here's what happened next," Sarah continued, leaning forward slightly. That banker's supervisor overheard our conversation. Instead of just disciplining the banker, she took the time to show him why his assumptions were wrong. That banker ended up becoming one of my strongest advocates in the financial industry. Outside the conference room, they could see Maria, the flight attendant, leading a group of passengers to one of Sarah's jets. The passengers were a diverse group, different races, ages, and styles of dress. All of them belonged there, all of them part of the private aviation world. I made every wrong assumption possible today, James admitted, finally meeting Sarah's eyes. I looked at your casual clothes, your race, your gender, and I decided I knew exactly who you were and where you belonged. I couldn't have been more wrong. Sarah nodded. And what did you learn from that? That I've been doing security wrong all these years, James replied, his voice stronger now. Real security isn't about judging people by how they look. It's about following proper procedures, checking actual credentials, and treating everyone with respect. A hint of a smile appeared on Sarah's face. Now that sounds more like a security professional. But why aren't you firing me? James asked suddenly. You have every right to. What I did was completely unprofessional and prejudiced. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her fleet of jets. Because firing you wouldn't solve the bigger problem, James. It wouldn't help you grow, and it wouldn't help others learn from this situation. She turned back to face him. Instead, I want you to help me design a new training program. Your experience today, your honest recognition of your mistakes, these can help other security personnel avoid making the same errors. James's eyes widened in surprise. You want me to help create training? Yes, Sarah replied firmly. Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons themselves. Your story, combined with proper security protocols and diversity training, could make a real difference. The weight of shame on James's shoulders began to lift slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose. He realized he was being offered not just forgiveness, but an opportunity to create positive change. I would be honored, he said quietly. And Ms. Chen Williams, thank you for seeing something in me worth saving. Sarah smiled fully now. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, James. The question is, what will you do with this opportunity? The morning sun had risen higher, its light now streaming directly through the blinds. Outside, another of Sarah's jets was preparing for takeoff, its engines beginning their familiar roar. It was the start of a new day, in more ways than one. 2 hours after the incident, Sarah and James sat in the airport's small cafeteria. The lunch crowd was starting to filter in, but they had found a quiet corner table near the window. Sarah had postponed her flight, feeling that this conversation was too important to rush. Tell me something, James, Sarah said, stirring her second cup of coffee. What did you imagine a private jet owner looked like before today? James shifted in his chair, uncomfortable but knowing honesty was important. I guess. I always pictured older white men in expensive suits, like the ones I saw in movies or magazines. He paused, realizing how limited this view had been. And in your 8 years of security work, Sarah continued gently, how many times did you question those men in expensive suits? James thought for a moment. Almost never, he admitted, his face showing shame as he understood the pattern. I just assumed they belonged. A group of pilots walked past their table, nodding respectfully at Sarah. Among them was a young female pilot, her uniform crisp and professional. James watched them pass, seeing the aviation world with new eyes. Let me tell you a story, Sarah said, pulling out her phone again. She showed James a photo of a young girl standing next to a small airplane. This is my daughter, Lisa. She's 12 now and dreams of becoming a pilot. Last month, someone asked her if she wouldn't rather be a flight attendant instead. James winced. Because she's a girl? Sarah nodded. People's assumptions start early, James. They tell my daughter what she can and can't be. Just like your assumptions today tried to tell me where I did and didn't belong. Through the cafeteria window, they could see planes taking off and landing. Each one carried different people with different stories, all of them deserving equal respect and professional treatment. I never thought about it that way, James said quietly, about how these small moments, these assumptions we make, can affect people's lives. Every time someone like you stops me, questions my right to be somewhere, or assumes I don't belong, Sarah continued, it's like a small brick in a wall. a wall that tries to keep people like me, like my daughter, from achieving their dreams. The cafeteria had grown busier, the lunch rush bringing in more airport staff and travelers. James noticed how diverse the crowd was, people of all backgrounds working together to keep the airport running smoothly. But you know what amazes me about walls? Sarah asked, drawing James's attention back. They can either be barriers, or they can become foundations for something better. It all depends on what we choose to do with those bricks. James leaned forward, genuinely interested. What do you mean? Well, take today for example. We could let your actions remain just another brick in that wall of prejudice. Or, she smiled slightly, we could use this experience to build something different, a training program that helps other security officers avoid making the same mistakes. A light of understanding appeared in James's eyes. Using my mistake to prevent others from making it too. Exactly, Sarah replied. Your story is powerful precisely because you recognize what you did wrong. You're willing to learn and change. That's rare, James, and it's valuable. Outside, one of Sarah's private jets was being prepared for departure. Ground crew members worked efficiently, each person playing their role regardless of who they were or what they looked like. Ms. Chen Williams, James said suddenly, I want to do more than just help with the training program. I want to learn everything I can about proper security procedures, about avoiding bias, about treating everyone with respect. Sarah's smile widened. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, and please call me Sarah. There's one thing I still don't understand, James admitted. Why are you taking so much time with me? You could have just had me fired and gone on with your day. Because change doesn't happen through punishment alone, Sarah explained. Real change happens through understanding, through conversations like this one, and sometimes the people who learn the hardest lessons become the best teachers. The afternoon sun had begun to slant through the cafeteria windows, creating long shadows across their table. It had been a long morning, but both Sarah and James knew that this conversation was just the beginning of something important. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the private terminal. The early morning sun found James Miller standing at his security post, but everything about him was different. His posture was professional yet welcoming, and his eyes showed alertness without judgment. Sarah had just arrived for her regular Monday morning flight. She smiled as she watched James efficiently check the credentials of a young female pilot wearing casual clothes under her jacket. His thoroughness was matched by his courtesy. No assumptions, no bias, just proper security protocol. Good morning, Miss Green, James said to the pilot, handing back her credentials. Have a safe flight. The pilot smiled, noting the difference in the terminal's atmosphere since James had started his new approach to security. Sarah walked up to the security checkpoint, her own ID ready. Good morning, James. I see you're putting our training sessions to good use. Over the past 3 weeks, James had not only attended but had become deeply involved in the new security training program. His story had become a powerful teaching tool, showing others how unconscious bias could affect their work. Sarah, James nodded professionally while checking her credentials, following proper protocol even though he now knew exactly who she was. We just finished training the second group of security officers yesterday. The response has been incredible. Behind Sarah, a diverse group of passengers approached the terminal. Among them was an elderly Asian businessman in casual clothes, a young black woman in an expensive suit, and a Middle Eastern man carrying pilot's documentation. James processed each of them with the same professional courtesy and attention to proper security procedures. Tell me about yesterday's session, Sarah said, stepping aside after clearing security. She had a few minutes before her flight, and she was genuinely interested in the program's progress. James's face lit up with enthusiasm. We had 20 officers from different terminals. When I shared my story about how I almost lost my job because of my prejudices, you could have heard a pin drop. But the best part came during the discussion afterward. A group of ground crew members walked past, and James paused to properly check their IDs before continuing. One officer admitted he'd been doing the same thing I did, making assumptions based on how people looked. Another talked about how she felt she had to dress extra professionally just to be taken seriously as a female security officer. Sarah watched as James handled multiple tasks at once, checking documents, maintaining security awareness, and carrying on their conversation. His professional growth over the past weeks had been remarkable. The biggest change, James continued, is in how we approach our jobs. We're actually providing better security now because we're following proper procedures for everyone, not just the people we think might be suspicious. Through the terminal windows, they could see Sarah's jet being prepared for departure. Captain Rodriguez was doing his pre-flight checks, and Maria, the flight attendant, was preparing the cabin. "You know what surprised me most?" James said, his voice thoughtful. "How many people thanked me for sharing my story? It helped them recognize their own biases, biases they didn't even know they had." Sarah checked her watch. She had a few more minutes. "And how does it feel, James? Being a teacher instead of just a security guard?" "It feels like I'm finally doing my job the right way," he replied. "Not just checking IDs and following rules, but actually making the airport safer and more welcoming for everyone." A new group of passengers entered the terminal, and James turned his attention to them, demonstrating the perfect balance of security awareness and respectful treatment that had become his trademark. "Oh, Sarah," he called out as she started to walk toward her gate, "you should see the new training manual we're developing. We've included real scenarios, proper procedures, and sections on recognizing and overcoming bias. Would you have time to review it this week?" Sarah smiled, noting how James had gone from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution. "I'll make time," she said. "This is too important to rush." As she walked toward her jet, Sarah reflected on how one difficult morning had transformed into something so positive. Behind her, she could hear James greeting more passengers, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned, grown, and was now helping others do the same. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning at Richardson Executive Airport. The private terminal buzzed with its usual morning activity, but something was noticeably different. At the security desk, James Miller stood tall, now wearing a new badge that read Senior Security Training Officer. Sarah walked through the terminal's glass doors, returning from a successful business trip. She paused for a moment, smiling at the scene before her. A group of new security officers stood with James, watching as he demonstrated proper ID checking procedures to a diverse group of passengers. "Remember," James was saying to his trainees, "every person who walks through these doors deserves the same professional treatment. Our job is to verify credentials, not make assumptions." The new officers nodded, taking notes as they watched him work. As Sarah approached, she noticed a familiar face among the passengers. The same banker who had doubted her business plan years ago. Now he was a regular client of Chen Williams Aviation, and he waved at her with respect. "Good morning, Sarah," James said professionally, checking her ID with the same careful attention he gave everyone. "We're just finishing up the morning training session. Would you believe this is our 10th group of officers?" The training program that had started with James's mistake had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Airports across the country had heard about their success and were requesting similar programs for their own security teams. "Miss Chen Williams," one of the new trainees spoke up, "Mr. Miller told us your story. What happened 6 months ago? Is it okay if I ask you something?" Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Of course." "What made you decide to give him a second chance? Most people would have just demanded he be fired." Sarah looked at James, who was now efficiently processing other passengers while still keeping an eye on his trainees. "Because I saw something important that day," she answered. "I saw someone who was willing to learn from their mistakes and help others learn too." Through the terminal windows, they could see one of Sarah's newer jets being prepared for takeoff. The ground crew was diverse, men and women of different backgrounds working together seamlessly. The sight reinforced everything their training program stood for. "You know what the best part is?" James added, joining the conversation during a quiet moment. "Our security statistics have actually improved. When you treat everyone with respect and follow proper procedures consistently, you create a safer environment for everyone." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed them some recent photos. One showed her daughter Lisa, now taking flying lessons. Another showed a group of young aviation students visiting the terminal, their faces full of hope and determination. "This is why our work matters," Sarah explained to the trainees. "Because somewhere out there, someone's daughter is dreaming of flying planes. Someone's son wants to own an aviation company, and when they walk into this terminal, they deserve to be judged by their credentials, not their appearance." James nodded in agreement. 6 months ago, I was the biggest obstacle to that dream. Now, I get to help make it possible." He turned to his trainees. That's why we focus so much on proper procedures and respectful treatment. It's not just about security, it's about creating opportunities. The morning sun had risen higher, filling the terminal with warm light. More passengers were arriving, and James's trainees watched carefully as he demonstrated how to handle the increasing flow of people efficiently and professionally. Sarah, James called out as she started to walk toward her office. The National Airport Security Conference called again. They want us to present our training program next month. They think it could become a standard across the country. Sarah turned back, smiling. Well, Senior Training Officer Miller, I think you better start preparing your presentation. As she walked away, Sarah could hear James returning to his duties, his voice clear and confident as he guided his trainees. What had started as an ugly incident had grown into something remarkable, a program that was changing minds, opening doors, and making the aviation world more welcoming for everyone. Through the terminal windows, another Chen Williams jet took off into the morning sky. Like the company itself, it rose above old barriers, carrying with it the promise of a future where everyone's dreams could soar, regardless of how they looked or where they came from.